Frank for probably all the wrong reasons. In my opinion, Frank Matthews was a much larger drug dealer than Frank Lucas.
In 1971, Frank Matthews first came on the police radar, but only by luck.
Well, it was rather peculiar. Had a report from some precinct that there was some unusual going on in an apartment building in Brooklyn.
This was going on, and Kowalski comes along, who was living at 130 Clarkson Avenue in Brooklyn, which incredibly, could you imagine this, was the same building, apartment building, that Frank Matthews was living in.
Well, this guy is complaining that there's all the parking places around his house on the weekends are all taken up by out-of-state cars, all going into one apartment.
And he started doing some investigating. And he saw that a lot of these guys were big-time drug dealers that had charges against them or were being investigated, coming from all over the East Coast and from the Midwest. And this was about 1970 it began. About 18 months or so later, he presented it to his superiors. And that's when the investigation began.
Special Agent Jerry Miller and Detective Roger Garay came to our office to break some bread with us and talk about a case they had called the Frank Matthews case.
Once they got the wiretaps up on Matthews' phones, the feds quickly realized just how big of a fish they had caught in their net.
They had a wiretap going, and I heard enough to know that we're not dealing here with an ordinary Brooklyn-based drug operation. It's very huge.
Nobody knew about this. I mean, you know, he was developing his network. He wasn't even on the radar. They had no investigation going. He was making millions of dollars a year. And if it wasn't for one cop named Joe Kowalski, that investigation might have not have started for another 10 years.
DEA quickly realized Matthews was setting up 100-kilo deals down in Venezuela with the French connection, which would have made him one of the biggest heroin dealers in the country already at that point.
We got calls with unbelievable people, which I won't discuss that.
The DEA office in Greensboro that I worked very closely with at the time got a phone call from a pharmacist, I believe, in Roxboro, North Carolina, reported to them that a black male wanted to purchase, I think, a 55-gallon drum of mannitol, which is a cutting agent. That's when his name first came to my attention.
So a federal team was formed consisting of DEA, IRS, and federal prosecutors to go after Matthews.
Much like what happened with the prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s, that gave birth to what we now know as organized crime in this country, the so-called mafia. the 1960s, there became a huge demand for drugs in this country. That gave rise to a new kind of organized crime, what I call drug kingpins or drug lords.
When Frank arrived in New York, probably in 66 or 67, the city and the whole country was really going crazy. Crime had doubled in a few years. You had the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam, and drugs. In 1959, there was about 100,000 heroin addicts in the country. By 69, there was over 1 million, and most of them were in the New York area.
It became almost like a perfect storm. And I was thrown right in the middle of that in 1971. I had a front row seat to what was really going on in the drug game.
In 70, 71, heroin was endemic. Entire blocks in Brooklyn, the entire apartment houses were addicted, and small $10 packages of heroin was being used, and President Nixon was furious.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
The President called all of us down to the White House for a meeting on his drug abuse plan. He was livid with rage when I told him what was going on in Brooklyn.
We had a heroin problem in the country and definitely in New York City. And heroin addicts created violence against innocent civilians.
They'd come from Staten Island, New Jersey, Long Island, Connecticut.
When you think about New York City in the 70s, I mean, you looked over your shoulder 3 or 4 times before you got to the train station or your car. I mean, it was a gangster town. You know, nobody wanted to go to New York City. The politicians made a lot of noise. The media focused on that, which forced law enforcement to go after those guys that were dealing heroin.
And of course, you couldn't have all that crime without police corruption.
Some former pushers say police were more interested in getting their heroin than arresting them.
On one occasion, I was dealing drugs, and they came and took all my drugs and just let me go.
Who's they?
The police.
6 weeks ago in Harlem, Black Panthers seized large quantities of heroin from drug peddlers and poured it into the street. They refused to turn it over to police because they insisted police would only resell it to the pushers.
It still took a little while before he was taken seriously. Let's face it, they couldn't believe that this black guy, was working in 21 states, with this huge network, and people were coming from all over the country to buy dope from him.
In the 70s, advent of civil rights, when African Americans were becoming more prominent in business, the drug dealers wanted to do the same thing.
A study was done in the mid-60s on a single black and Spanish Harlem. They found that 33% of the population was addicted to heroin. 1/3 of all the men
at that time, I think was probably under 30 years old, was extremely bright, had good leadership skills, and had convened a meeting of all of the top African American and Hispanic drug dealers in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1971.
And I assume that this meant that he had finally gotten confident that he had locked in his contacts with the French connection down in Venezuela, and he was really ready to roll.
And his goal was to unite and form a family where they cut out the Italian mafia and went right to the source of heroin and brought it in and controlled the distribution.
Miami, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Atlanta, similar information was coming back. Some guy named Matthews was behind the local organizations in those cities. And he had been identified as one of the largest, if not the largest, heroin trafficker in the United States. There's been a lot of recent movies on Lucas being the king of drugs. That's not true. And Matthews was the #1 heroin pioneer. Nicky Bonds and all them. It wasn't nothing. He couldn't touch Frank. I don't know why they built him up back then. Nicky Bonds was supplying New York. Frank supplying about 25 states. Had he not been, his wings not been clipped in 72, he would have ruled the United States. In my opinion, Frank Matthews was a much larger drug dealer than Frank Lucas.
So here you have a black guy meeting a Cuban to a Puerto Rican to get heroin from French gangsters. United Nations of crime.
Black power was for equality for African Americans. Black gangsters were committing illegal crimes. They're destroying the community, okay? So, you know, as they say in the street, you don't want to get this thing twisted.
Even though the U.S. economy was booming in the late 60s, the inner cities were dying. Just as the black population started coming up to the north in mass, industrial jobs started declining. By the early 60s, heroin is getting popular in places like Harlem, Baltimore, Detroit.
And then around 1964, 65, it was really growing. It was booming like
A river of money is flowing because business is so good.
Put this together with the big pool of unemployed black males that are on the streets of the cities, and you have the birth of a new industry. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people standing on the corner selling drugs. And that's the world that Frank Matthews took over.
My name is Clinton Shorty Buse. I was born I'm a native of Baltimore, Maryland. It was a poor community. We lived in poor housing. From that poor us right back into the poor community.
I grew up on a small tobacco farm in eastern North Carolina, not far from where Frank lived. And I actually grew up in sort of similar circumstances. You know, my father was a sharecropper.
In 1959, I went to New York as a gambler. See, I used to gamble, play crab cards. I was what you call a Solomon.
I had a lot of sympathy for them. A lot of them were extremely intelligent.
We didn't have many choices. So if you don't have a choice, you have to take a chance.
They could not make money in the real world. They were not given the education opportunities that the whites had.
So a lot of us took to what was available for us, you know, gambling, trying to pimp women, drug dealing.
I needed money. I like nice clothes, pretty women. They paid you, what, $1.55 an hour. And the only other way I knew to earn that type of money was in narcotics.
African American parents, my parents marched with Dr. King, but that became something they wanted for their children, to be able to go to college, to be educated, and become earners in society. And the drug guys were pushing heroin.
Wow, I started in the drug game kind of early. In the early 60s, selling what they call yellow jackets, red devils.
So you had kids who their parents had struggled and marched and wanted to make sure that they were extremely successful, suddenly got involved in drugs. So it was just destroying the African American community.
I went to the corner of 111th Street and 7th Avenue for $65 worth of dope. Brought it back downtown, bagged it up into $2 bags.
So a guy might have been a stick-up guy. He might stop sticking up and start selling drugs because he had a less chance of getting caught. Just started gravitating toward that way of life.
To try and understand Frank Matthews, you have to understand the area around Durham, North Carolina. That's where he grew up at. It was a really unique time and place.
Three of the biggest drug kingpins in the United States at that time were black and were all from North Carolina. It was Frank Lucas, Leslie Ike Atkinson, and Frank Pee Wee Matthews.
I was working at a supermarket. He was working over in North Durham. All of us were trying to make a nickel and a dime to keep ourselves going. I met him, and we clicked and talked and everything else. And we was like two homeboys.
Durham, North Carolina is deep with rich black history. Some of the first business in Durham. Started out in 1871. We're the fifth oldest black funeral home in the United States.
Me just being a southern country boy, I thought black and white race was great. A lot of blacks in Durham had a lot of money. It was very wealthy blacks in Durham.
We had 3 white businesses, 1 Oriental restaurant, 125 black businesses.
But Durham, in comparison to other cities in the South, was not a rampant racist place.
No murders, no hangings, no lynchings.
The whole atmosphere of Durham in the 50s and 60s gave us the incentive to try to achieve more.
And I will always use the word the Godfather. The Godfather of the black community back in the late 1800s was the man himself, Washington Duke, Duke University.
The high school Frank attended produced many notable people, and it sent most of its graduates on to college. And now I came from a family of 13, and out of our 13, 12 of us went to college. It came from a thriving community that produced a lot of people that really succeeded in mainstream society. Now, why he chose to take the path he did is probably a secret we'll never know.
My classmate, Shirley Caesar, gospel singer, Ernie Barnes, the artist, my classmate.
They got a 325 people out of my graduating class from Hillside. I think 300 of us went to college.
The briefs written for the Supreme Court decision of desegregation, North Carolina College of Durham.
We knew we had to be the best. We were taught that by our parents.
It wasn't unusual for young blacks in that day to want to move up and better themselves. They all wanted to make it big.
Ironically, Frank Matthews' only real conviction that we know of was for stealing chickens down in Durham when he was a teenager.
Yeah, I think it was spring of 1961. I know it was a real pretty Saturday afternoon. Me and one of my partners received a call after the Old Farm Exchange Poultry Department said stealing chicken. Saw a young black male running through the woods behind some houses back toward Canal Street in Durham. Saw the young gentleman come up to a house on Canal Street, and we approached him, and we arrested him for stealing chickens that day.
That all of us were thieves per se, because all of us made a side hustle here and there. But no, he just the rumor was he got arrested for stealing chicken. He may have gotten caught, but he wasn't the only one that stole chickens at the farmer's exchange. No.
The best I can remember, we said to the judge that he was cooperative with us, and being a 16-year-old,
I think the judge slapped him on the back of his hand, and he left Durham probably the year after he was arrested here.
So Frank leaves Durham as a teenager and he goes to Philadelphia. He stays there briefly. It appears he got in some kind of trouble for running numbers there, but probably not convicted of anything. And he left Philadelphia. He goes to Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, becomes a barber. Barbershop's a perfect place to keep running numbers.
If you wanted to be a big-time gangster, where would you go? You'd go to New York City. He started off as a barber, Bedford-Stuyvesant, met a big-time numbers king. Because of Frank's personality, I guess, took him under his wing and tried to get him introduced to the Italians so that Frank could get into the drug trade. It's very unclear what happened at the meeting. I believe it was with the Gambino crime family, and they turned him down for whatever reason. And so Frank, for all intents and purposes, should have been shut out of the drug trade and maybe end up as a low-ranking member of the trade like most blacks at that time.
At that time, we really didn't believe that the ethnic backgrounds of these people in the inner cities didn't give them the power to do the things the mafia did.
It was a monopoly. It was one of the biggest monopolies in history. 95% of the heroin coming into the United States at that time came through the so-called French connection. You had poppies in Turkey, you had the laboratories in Marseille, and you had the distribution network through Montreal and New York City.
Through the Puerto Rican numbers dealer, Frank met another contact, Rolando Gonzalez, who was Cuban. Gonzalez got indicted in New York. He fled to Venezuela, but before he left, he sold Frank his first kilo of drugs. Frank was off and running.
Rolando, an astute dealer too, wanted to meet Frank.
So Gonzalez gets down to Venezuela and he hooks up with the remnants of the French connection.
Frank was going down there at one time for other people than himself. Then Frank showed up alone, and then he became so powerful that they decided to work with him.
Frank is on his own, and he's getting heroin directly from the French connection. The only black guy, the only non-mafia person, really, in the United States to be dealing directly with the French connection.
A drug connection was sacred. If you had a drug connection, man, you had something going on.
He did go down to Venezuela, Caracas. And he was awaiting the delivery of 6
pounds of heroin.
It was really a golden time to be a drug dealer. The U.S. economy was hitting on all cylinders. The streets were full of money.
So any night of the week, everybody has on their jewelry, their furs, or summertime, their diamonds, their cars. They come up, they looking, hang out. The women on any given night, Frank Matthews, Mickey Barnes, Phoebe Kirkland, all the players.
It was a joyous time in New York. Everybody was making money. Everybody was happy. People running from this place to that place. It was just marvelous. It was a marvelous place to be. And then you had a lot of nightclubs in New York that were so fabulous. You had the Bell Cook and Candle on 58th Street. You had Will Small's Paradise.
Because all the cuties would be there, all the players would ride through, and those are all in Harlem. I'm a Harlem night.
Frank was supplying the biggest drug dealers in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Boston, New Haven, Connecticut, Miami, New Orleans, all over the country.
In terms of the New York scene, he's definitely the biggest gangster that came out of New York, and he may be the biggest gangster, period.
Now, I have never seen Frank with any money or doing any dealers or anything like that. His relationship with me was one good friend to another good friend. His word and my word.
He was a guy that had great leadership skills and knew how to control a product, make distribution all along the East Coast, and control an organization through violence and intimidation.
Because I don't know what Frank did for a living, but I know he was always there for me if I needed him.
Within a couple of years, he was one of the biggest drug dealers in the history of the country, and it's really amazing. I mean,
DEA had information he was getting heroin in up to 100-kilo increments, pure heroin from the French Connection. By the time those hit the street at, say, 10% purity, that means 100 keys is 1,000 keys. And if they're $20,000 each wholesale, it's $20 million.
we talk about Frank Lucas, right? We talk about Mickey Barnes. They were essentially New York dealers, New Jersey dealers.
That's all I heard. Nicky this, Nicky that, Nicky. I didn't really get an understanding about Frank until I rose in this lifestyle.
He wasn't investigated. He probably would have set up a truly national and then eventually an international network that would have just boggled the mind. He was in a league of his own. And he was a top, not only an organizer, but a businessman. He saw himself as that.
he posed as a real estate developer, which was a front. But he bought a whole series of parcels of land where he was informed the federal highway was going to go in. Had that gone through, he would have been a multi-millionaire just on the real estate.
This is a story that I know to be true, you know, because I was there when the gentleman asked him and reminded him. He had given $1 million to a friend to hold. And disappeared again. So when the gentleman sees him again, he say, Frank, when you gonna come get that money? And Frank goes, what money? He says, yo, man, you remember you gave me the shopping bags, those shopping bags, that money? He said, I'll come get it in a week or so. So, how much money does he have?
When I first met him, his name was not out there like that, but as the years went, like a couple of years later, 68, 69, his name was ringing like doorbells.
Word was in Durham that he was taking over the black mafia, was the word in Durham. And that was the way it was described back to us at the police department. And I said, not little Frankie, ain't nowhere in the world that he gets that big. And he did.
First time I saw him, he's just like a little country boy to me. Bad shirt, I think it was, on Lenox Avenue and 140-something Street. And I started, following. Frank was doing a walk and talk with somebody on the street, and I'm watching the movements of Frank, and I smacked right into a car. Frank came over and said, these damn photographers, with damn drivers, honky drivers.
I tell you, he was out in front of us all the time. I hate to say it.
I'd say he was definitely smarter than Frank, okay? Frank Lucas, yeah. Definitely. The reports are he controlled the Eastern Seaboard. So he was definitely a leader at a very young age.
He had this penchant for blondes, befriended one, bought her an apartment, but beat the hell out of her at one time. He had too much coke in him.
At the same time, he had a common law wife named Barbara Hinton. He was married and had 3 children.
Frank's appetite for women was legendary. He supposedly had girlfriends all over the country, but he still maintained a fairly normal home life with Barbara Hinton and his kids. And Barbara Hinton even hired a tutor to come into the house, like, any typical middle-class mother to help the kids after school.
I started teaching in Brooklyn in 1968. I taught elementary school, grade 4 at the time. And around 1971, I started working for a tutoring service in Brooklyn. And one of the clients that we had was what I call the Matthew family, and I was sent there probably because I lived and worked in the area where they lived. They lived in Flatbush. I lived in Flatbush and worked in the Flatbush area, so I was probably the closest tutor, and I was sent to their home in the apartment on Clarkson Avenue. As very nice boys, very well behaved, did the work. In all honesty, I don't know that they necessarily needed tutoring per se. I was paid weekly, yes. I was paid $100 for the week. So I never really got into what Mr. Matthews was doing. At one time, she once mentioned to me something about we're in real estate. And then I just assumed that they were in real estate. Rang the bell and the door opened, and it actually was Frank, who now I know was Frank Matthews. And he told me that the family would be there in a few minutes. I was, they were out, whatever they were doing, and I should come in.
By this time, Frank is generating unheard of amounts of cash. The feds heard him on a wiretap. It's some deal in a hotel in the Bronx, talking about having $4 million in cash with him.
It was right by the 41st precinct. There was a stadium motel. He put $4 million on a table at one time. And he bragged about this. And he says, let me see if you can match this. And nobody could at the time.
Now, $4 million in cash in 1971 or 2 is like $25 million now. So those are the amounts of money Frank Matthews was using on a daily basis. The police really started to get a sense of what was going on, the scope of Frank's operation, when they raided an apartment that probably belonged to his lieutenant, Mickey Beckwith, in Brooklyn. They nicknamed it the Ponderosa. The Ponderosa is where they would process the heroin.
And he would, this is a classic. He would have them at the table with no clothes on. And they were cutting up drugs with the deck of cards and filling the glassine envelopes. Think 10,000, 20,000 bags a night. The drug cutters would work at the Ponderosa, which was 101 East 56th Street at the time. We called it the Ponderosa. We were bagging up, cutting dope. It took us an hour to get through the doors. We finally had to break a wall down. That's when we realized, and the bosses realized that he was not just a street dealer. He was an international trafficker.
They cut so much dope in the Ponderosa that when the police raided it, they found a half kilo in residue just left on the floor.
Them mixing the drugs with paddles from canoes. 2 million glassine envelopes.
$10 worth of heroin in each one is $25 million they were gonna pack up in that one location.
The drug cutters would work for 24, 36 hours straight.
One DEA document I saw talked about the time when one of Frank's cutters died in the Ponderosa because he had inhaled too much heroin, and the confidential informant told them that when the police came, Frank came outside and told them he was gonna handle it and to leave, and they did. One of the DEA case agents told me at the time trying to make a case on Frank Matthews was like trying to arrest God. So Frank is supplying the biggest drug dealers in most of the cities up and down the East Coast. Philadelphia was probably his biggest stronghold. He worked with people like Major Coxon, Cadillac Tommy Farrington, who came up with him from Durham, North Carolina, John Pop Darby, who became his right-hand man, and Tyrone Mr. Millionaire Palmer.
But there are a lot of people, even in the Frank's organization, that were killed and executed in Philadelphia.
At the time, Philly's drug underworld was under siege by a group calling themselves the Black Mafia.
Philadelphia and Darby's section, when they cut a drug dealer's head off and put his head on the outside window rail of a bar where drug dealers hung out.
The Black Mafia were Nation of Islam members that operated out of Temple Number 12 in Philadelphia. They were extorting drug dealers. They were selling drugs themselves. They were involved in a lot of murders.
The Black Mafia, resented the fact that Frank was trying to set up franchises, which what they were. He was trying to franchise his operation.
Did he pull the trigger? No. Did violence bother him? Not at all. And he had underlings like Beckwith and Pop Darby and a lot of other people could have easily whacked anybody they wanted to, and they did, of course. We know that.
The song is King Soul. The song is King Soul. No shatas, real laughing and anashaya. Right. Sabebe, sebebo, babala, sipipi, le pufi, si, amemisi, amemebepo, amama, talala, pupe, puto. Dadala, shatala, pubala, uvala, uvale la pubala, siyamiyete, baba pala pusiyete, liyetiye, so, kuye fiye fifeto, puse, mama sike, que pube pe pufe, pe putete, tutto cole per mia papa la masicata. Siketiete leteri mi sikoto polo pufoto la papatana chike. Supo petule vepe pute puvle kiete tisa mama papa. Osama Shata Obama Kalapu Papa Vatala Mama Hitele Koto Toro tel kosia mama me yepite. Sute pouve pepe pete pe basse tale maseka. Tale pape tape la veyete le pedala. You dala, fodala, you dala, zombie dala pou papa, o ogole pou bebe. Sika tu sete, ziye mime mumete, kuse poupe pou meche, poupe pou meche fete. Mwen la pou sete, pou 10, pou 12, pou 30, pou 1019, pa, 10,000 ba, kob, forma pou baba, siyete la pou zami, koutou katete le pe, pouve pou pete le pe, macheta pousse, kouse pouve pou men pou mache la pou vle, pou mboussou, pou mfoutou, pou mle, pou mte doussou, pou mvou, pou mpemoussou, pou moussou, aboyou, amolou, apochou, to kiss. The millennium, the nellium, million pour million, the months, the days, the seconds, the hours, the days, mon pepe, pour parler pas, patre, me sikata, chiki yete, sous côté pour les pour fêter, rama papa rana nirete, sous saba. Udala la pumdola, vie bebe sika chika ni kerene de tolo pro popotolo pumfoto preme me koto eremi pipi si papa ureme papa rama papa saba papa rama papa hote piyete suse pumpete. Pour les moussete, cousse pour faire, pour les bas, c'est là qu'on fait, te côté, que tia tata chaka, kala pumba le kate la mene pirameta, supa pete po profeto, reme papa mecho. Reme pepe fille, kote punte pundeso, beso, kopa papa tale de niyatala. Reme papa nere niya nanasi c'était là où te vle ton fils. A forte miye pipe pete. Saudi là, le poufila, kacheka, kike tele, popo koteke, qui se tele, kote kola popa kiye, eka, vie, ama, siye, dole, pumdola, pumasite. Ouvi, pute, passete, le pouffe, approche de car, coupe, machete pour le pouffe, achieve the men of the horses, la pour le pouffe, achieve all the men of cars, masuse pute, ou basute, le pouffe, boussale, pour clé pute, ou macheta mo pour le pousser, cous avec doigt moins pour le pousser pour ta paramamasa, une chata, American chata, don't blacka, mena blacka don't la pour même son pas, va poupée pour ton ma, fouquet pour ton cas. Parler pour parler là pour marcher, me valer là pour valer, me coussale pour battre, Sou kote pou m'vale, pou sou te pou m'tase, trase la pou m'vale, kou sabe pou m'dase, reneria, reme papa, neme mesikia, vi, pou pushado, asila, I push the doors to windows, the roof, the floors. Now you know the song is not for folk. I flow with you. Push I cop you black for Doris you. I got them motherfucking shit. I like the chorus you. Block me for the jet out the door. I push the windows back to see. The floors force you. I push the coupe back to window so I forward to you doors. Nigga push the coupe, not horse you. I push the horse to doors. I window course you. Finna see his pad, nigga, I like to see you horse you. I push the coupe back the fucking poops, I horse you. I'm the floors, got the towel on the floor, horse you. Push the coupe, got the back like horse, force you, force you, force you, pour floor, pour four, I pour forth, I pour forth. Like the windows of a glass door, I push it forth. To the door, you, I adore you, and window floors floor you. To the roof, I pour you. Water like a horseman, push horses to the horseman. You walking like a horseman, gotta walk and talking horseman. I foot so you, I boss man. Harm you and him, you to the hymns. I walk a force man. You rappers and you rapping. Talking to you capping for the water bottle for the horseman, you know I'm trapping.